The hidden architecture of manipulation. Most people imagine manipulation as something obvious, dramatic, and easy to recognize. They imagine villains who lie openly, aggressors who shout, or people whose bad intentions are clearly visible. But the reality of psychological manipulation is much quieter, far more subtle, and far more dangerous. Manipulators rarely announce themselves. They don't begin relationships by showing control, cruelty, or domination. Instead, they begin with warmth, charm, attention, and emotional intensity. They create trust before they create confusion. They create attachment before they create dependence. And by the time the manipulation becomes visible, the psychological structure is already built. The uncomfortable truth is that manipulation is not about intelligence or ignorance. Highly intelligent people get manipulated. Emotionally aware people get manipulated. Kind people get manipulated even more often than others because the traits that make someone empathetic, patient, forgiving, and understanding are the exact traits manipulators know how to exploit. Manipulation works because it slowly distorts your perception of reality. It doesn't force control immediately. Instead, it reshapes how you interpret events, how you interpret your own emotions, and eventually how you interpret yourself. Over time, you begin to doubt things you once knew with certainty. You begin to question your reactions. You begin to justify behavior that once would have been unacceptable. And this shift does not happen in a single moment. It happens gradually, through a set of psychological tactics that manipulators repeat over and over again until they become invisible patterns inside the relationship. Among these tactics, there are several that appear again and again in manipulative dynamics. They are not random behaviors. They are psychological strategies designed to destabilize you emotionally while strengthening the manipulator's control. The first and perhaps most destructive of these tactics is something known as gaslighting. Gaslighting is not simply lying. It is something far more calculated. It is the systematic attempt to make another person doubt their own perception of reality. The manipulator does not merely deny something that happened. They deny it with such confidence, repetition, and emotional pressure that the victim begins to question their own memory. Imagine confronting someone about something hurtful they said. Instead of acknowledging it, they respond with complete certainty that never happened. At first, you may push back. You may insist that you clearly remember the moment. But the manipulator doesn't stop there. They add layers to the denial. They say things like you're imagining things. You're too sensitive. You always twist my words. You're remembering it wrong. Over time, this repetition creates a crack in your certainty. And once that crack appears, manipulation becomes much easier. Because when you stop trusting your own perception, you begin relying on the manipulator's interpretation of events instead. Gaslighting works because human memory is not perfect. Our brains constantly reconstruct memories rather than replay them like recordings. Manipulators exploit this natural weakness. They introduce doubt into situations where clarity once existed. They change small details, dismiss conversations, rewrite emotional moments, and slowly teach you that your version of reality is unreliable. What makes gaslighting especially powerful is that it often appears alongside moments of affection. The manipulator may deny something hurtful in one moment and then act loving the next. This emotional contrast confuses the brain. When kindness follows confusion, people tend to resolve the discomfort by assuming the conflict must have been a misunderstanding. Instead of concluding that the manipulator is lying, the mind often concludes that it must have misinterpreted the situation. Over time, victims of gaslighting begin to experience a specific psychological state. They start apologizing for things they did not do. They start explaining themselves excessively. They replay conversations in their head, wondering whether they misunderstood something obvious. They become cautious about expressing concerns because every attempt to address a problem leads to more confusion. This erosion of confidence is not accidental. It is the goal. Because once a person doubts their own perception, the manipulator becomes the authority on reality. But gaslighting rarely appears alone. It is often preceded by another powerful tactic that creates emotional attachment before the manipulation even begins. That tactic is known as love bombing. Love bombing is the sudden flood of attention, affection, and admiration that some manipulators use at the beginning of a relationship. To the person receiving it, it feels intoxicating. The connection seems immediate and intense. The manipulator expresses overwhelming interest, constant communication, deep compliments, and declarations of emotional closeness that seem unusually fast. They may say things like, "I've never felt this way about anyone before. You understand me better than anyone," or "I feel like we were meant to meet." They give attention constantly. Messages appear every morning and every night. Compliments arrive frequently. Emotional intimacy accelerates far faster than what is typical in healthy relationships. To the brain, this intensity triggers powerful chemical responses. Dopamine increases. Oxytocin increases. Emotional attachment forms quickly because the experience feels rare and meaningful. When someone suddenly treats you as if you are incredibly special, incredibly understood, and incredibly important, it activates a deep psychological reward system. But the purpose of love bombing is not genuine connection. It is investment. The manipulator is creating a strong emotional bond as quickly as possible. Because the stronger the attachment becomes, the harder it will be for the victim to leave later when the manipulation begins. What makes love bombing especially confusing is that the early stage can feel perfect. The manipulator seems attentive, supportive, emotionally open, and deeply interested. They appear to be everything someone could want in a relationship. This stage often creates the memory that victims hold on to later when the dynamic becomes painful. They remember the early version of the person and believe that version is the real one. When manipulation later appears, they assume the problem must be temporary. They assume stress, misunderstandings, or external circumstances must be responsible for the change. In reality, the early stage was the performance. The affection was not a reflection of stable emotional behavior. It was a strategy designed to build attachment quickly. And once that attachment is secure, the manipulator gradually begins to change the emotional environment of the relationship. Attention becomes inconsistent. Compliments become rare. Criticism appears more often. Emotional warmth becomes conditional. This shift creates a powerful psychological loop. The victim begins chasing the early version of the relationship. They try to earn back the affection that once came so easily. They analyze their behavior, trying to understand what changed. They wonder if they did something wrong. This confusion increases emotional investment even further because the mind keeps trying to solve the mystery of what happened to the connection that once felt so strong. And this is where another manipulative tactic often appears, a tactic that weaponizes silence itself. The silent treatment is one of the most psychologically destabilizing behaviors in manipulative relationships. At first glance, it might appear simple. Someone stops responding. They withdraw communication. They become distant. But the silent treatment is not the same as healthy space or temporary distance. Healthy distance is communicated clearly. Someone might say, "I need some time to cool down. Let's talk later." The silent treatment is different because it is intentionally ambiguous. The manipulator does not explain what is happening. They simply disappear emotionally. Messages go unanswered. Conversations become short or non-existent. Emotional connection suddenly vanishes. For the person experiencing it, this creates intense anxiety. Human beings are wired to interpret social rejection as a threat. When someone important suddenly withdraws communication without explanation, the brain interprets it as a signal that the relationship itself may be in danger. This activates the same neurological pain circuits associated with physical injury. In other words, social exclusion literally hurts the brain. Manipulators understand this instinctively, even if they cannot explain the psychology behind it. The silent treatment becomes a form of punishment. It communicates disapproval without explanation, forcing the victim to search desperately for what they might have done wrong. During this silence, the victim's mind becomes extremely active. They replay recent conversations. They examine their own behavior. They imagine possible mistakes. They begin reaching out more frequently, trying to repair something that was never clearly defined as broken. And when the manipulator finally returns to normal communication, the victim often feels relief so strong that they become even more compliant. They avoid raising concerns in the future because they fear triggering the silence again. In this way, the silent treatment trains behavior. It teaches the victim that expressing boundaries or confronting problems leads to emotional abandonment. And over time, the victim adapts by suppressing their own needs to maintain connection. This is how manipulation slowly reshapes a person's behavior without ever explicitly demanding obedience. Instead of direct control, the manipulator creates emotional consequences that guide the victim's actions automatically. But the deeper structure of manipulation does not stop here. Gaslighting confuses reality. Love bombing creates attachment. The silent treatment punishes resistance. And as the relationship continues, more tactics appear that expand the manipulator's influence even further. These tactics are not random emotional reactions. They form a psychological system designed to keep one person uncertain, emotionally dependent, and increasingly disconnected from their own instincts. And the most unsettling part is that many victims do not realize what is happening until the patterns have repeated dozens or even hundreds of times. Because manipulation rarely feels like manipulation in the moment, it feels like confusion. It feels like trying harder to fix something. It feels like attempting to restore harmony in a relationship that once felt meaningful. But behind that confusion, a very specific structure of control is slowly taking shape. And understanding that structure is the first step in seeing manipulation clearly. The psychological web that keeps you trapped once manipulation begins. It rarely relies on a single tactic. Manipulators do not depend on one strategy because any single behavior can eventually become obvious. Instead, they layer multiple psychological tactics together, creating a confusing emotional environment where it becomes difficult to identify what is really happening. After gaslighting weakens your confidence in your own perception, after love bombing creates deep emotional attachment, and after the silent treatment teaches you that conflict leads to emotional withdrawal, another tactic often begins to appear. This tactic is known as triangulation. Triangulation is a manipulation strategy where a third person is introduced into the emotional dynamic in order to create insecurity, competition, or comparison. The manipulator uses this third presence not necessarily to form a real relationship with them, but to destabilize the person they want to control. The third person could be an ex-partner, a friend, a coworker, or even a completely hypothetical person mentioned in conversation. The manipulator may casually say things like, "My coworker thinks I deserve someone who appreciates me more," or "My ex never complained about this kind of thing," or "Other people understand me better." These statements are rarely direct accusations. Instead, they are subtle comparisons that trigger insecurity. The message underneath the words is simple: someone else might replace you. This activates a deep psychological fear. Human beings are highly sensitive to social replacement. The possibility that we might lose our place in someone's life creates anxiety that can push people into proving their worth. Manipulators exploit this instinct. When triangulation begins, the victim often starts trying harder to maintain their position. They may become more accommodating, more patient, and more tolerant of behaviors that would normally feel unacceptable. The manipulator, meanwhile, maintains control by carefully balancing attention and comparison. Sometimes they may praise the victim, restoring a sense of importance. Other times they may bring up the third person again, reigniting the feeling of competition. This back and forth keeps the victim emotionally invested and uncertain at the same time. One of the most deceptive aspects of triangulation is that it often appears subtle. The manipulator may claim they are simply sharing stories or talking about other people in their life. If the victim expresses discomfort, the manipulator can easily dismiss the concern by saying something like, "You're overreacting," or "I'm just being honest." This response serves two purposes. First, it invalidates the victim's emotional reaction. Second, it reinforces the gaslighting pattern that may already exist in the relationship. Over time, the victim begins to question whether their jealousy or discomfort is irrational. even when the manipulator is intentionally provoking those feelings. But triangulation is not always about romantic competition. Sometimes it involves authority figures or social groups. A manipulator might say things like, "Everyone thinks you're being difficult," or "My friends all agree with me," or "People have been noticing your attitude." These statements are designed to isolate the victim psychologically. Even if the third parties do not actually hold those opinions, the suggestion alone creates social pressure. Humans are deeply influenced by the perceived opinion of the group. When someone believes multiple people are judging them negatively, they often begin adjusting their behavior to regain acceptance. The manipulator uses this imagined consensus to reinforce their authority. Instead of appearing like one person's criticism, their opinion now feels like the judgment of many. This makes the victim far more likely to accept it. Over time, triangulation erodes the victim's confidence in their own perspective. They begin wondering if others really do see them as the manipulator describes. They may become hesitant to express disagreement because they fear appearing unreasonable or selfish in the eyes of a larger group. In reality, the manipulator is carefully controlling the narrative. They decide what information is shared, how events are framed, and which comparisons are emphasized. The victim, meanwhile, only sees fragments of the situation and tries to interpret them as honestly as possible. This imbalance of information allows the manipulator to shape the emotional landscape of the relationship. But perhaps one of the most powerful tools manipulators use is something far more emotionally invasive than comparison or silence. It is the strategic use of guilt. Guilt manipulation is particularly effective because it targets the moral instincts of empathetic people. Most individuals want to see themselves as kind, fair, and compassionate. Manipulators exploit this desire by framing their own needs as moral obligations for the victim. Instead of directly demanding compliance, they present situations in a way that makes refusal feel like cruelty. A manipulator might say things like, "After everything I've done for you, this is how you treat me," or "I guess I just care more about this relationship than you do," or "I'm clearly not important to you." These statements are carefully constructed emotional traps. They do not directly state what the victim must do. Instead, they imply that failing to meet the manipulator's expectation means failing morally. This is psychologically powerful because it shifts the conflict away from behavior and toward identity. The victim is no longer just disagreeing with the request. They are now being positioned as selfish, ungrateful, or uncaring. Most people experience deep discomfort when they believe they are hurting someone they care about. Manipulators know this. They exaggerate their emotional suffering to make the victim feel responsible for fixing it. Even when the victim's boundary is reasonable, the manipulator frames it as abandonment or betrayal. Over time, the victim learns that asserting personal needs leads to emotional guilt. As a result, they begin suppressing those needs in order to avoid feeling like the bad person in the situation. This pattern gradually reshapes the power dynamic of the relationship. The manipulator's emotions become the center of attention, while the victim's emotions become secondary or invisible. Another common variation of guilt manipulation involves portraying oneself as the victim. The manipulator may describe their own struggles, hardships, or sacrifices in ways that make disagreement seem insensitive. They might say things like, "You know how hard things have been for me, or I'm already dealing with so much." These statements may contain elements of truth, but the purpose is not genuine vulnerability. The purpose is leverage. By emphasizing their own suffering, the manipulator makes it emotionally difficult for the victim to challenge them. Any attempt to address the manipulator's behavior can then be reframed as an attack on someone who is already struggling. This creates a psychological double bind. If the victim remains silent, the manipulator's behavior continues unchecked. If the victim speaks up, they risk appearing heartless or unsupportive. The easiest way to escape this emotional tension is often compliance, and this is exactly what the manipulator intends. Over time, guilt manipulation can create a deep internal conflict within the victim. They may feel exhausted, frustrated, and unhappy in the relationship, but leaving or confronting the situation triggers intense feelings of responsibility. They begin telling themselves stories that justify staying. They think things like, maybe I'm expecting too much, maybe they're just going through a hard time, maybe if I'm more patient things will improve. These thoughts are not signs of weakness. They are signs that the manipulator's psychological strategies are working exactly as intended, because manipulation rarely forces someone to stay. Instead, it reshapes the emotional logic that makes leaving feel wrong. Another element that strengthens manipulation is unpredictability. Manipulators often alternate between kindness and cruelty, warmth and distance, affection and criticism. This pattern creates what psychologists sometimes call intermittent reinforcement. The brain becomes highly focused on unpredictable rewards. When positive treatment appears occasionally but not consistently, people tend to work harder to obtain it. This is the same psychological principle used in gambling systems. The uncertainty of reward keeps people engaged far longer than predictable outcomes would. In manipulative relationships, intermittent kindness can keep victims emotionally invested even when the overall dynamic is painful. They remember the good moments and hope those moments will return permanently. But the unpredictability is not accidental. It is part of the control system. When affection becomes unpredictable, the victim begins monitoring their own behavior constantly. They try to avoid triggering the manipulator's negative reactions. They try to recreate the circumstances that once led to kindness. In doing so, they place increasing responsibility on themselves for maintaining the relationship's emotional stability. The manipulator, meanwhile, avoids accountability because their behavior appears inconsistent rather than intentionally harmful. The victim often tells themselves that the manipulator is complicated, stressed, misunderstood, or emotionally damaged. This interpretation allows the relationship to continue because it frames the problem as something temporary rather than structural. But the structure of manipulation is becoming stronger with every cycle. Gaslighting weakens perception. Love bombing builds attachment. The silent treatment punishes resistance. Triangulation creates insecurity. Guilt manipulation shapes moral responsibility. And intermittent reinforcement locks the victim into a psychological loop where leaving becomes increasingly difficult. The most troubling aspect of this process is how gradual it feels from the inside. Each individual incident may seem small. Each moment can be rationalized or explained away. But when these tactics accumulate over time, they form a powerful system of emotional control that can deeply affect a person's identity, confidence, and sense of reality. And by the time many people begin to see the pattern clearly, the manipulator has already spent months or years shaping the psychological environment of the relationship. But there is still one more critical layer to understand. Because the final stage of manipulation is not just about controlling behavior, it is about reshaping how the victim sees themselves. And once that shift occurs, the manipulator no longer needs to enforce control actively. The victim begins enforcing it on themselves. When manipulation becomes invisible, the final stage of psychological manipulation is the most dangerous because it often becomes invisible. At this point, the manipulator no longer needs to constantly apply pressure, arguments, or emotional tactics. The system they built earlier has already reshaped the victim's thinking patterns. Instead of needing to control every situation, the manipulator simply relies on the internal rules that now exist inside the victim's mind. This is the moment when manipulation becomes self-sustaining. The person being manipulated begins filtering their own thoughts, emotions, and behavior automatically. They start predicting what might upset the manipulator and adjust themselves before conflict even begins. They hesitate before expressing discomfort. They rehearse conversations internally before speaking. They carefully analyze tone, wording, and timing to avoid triggering negative reactions. On the surface, it may look like the relationship has stabilized. Arguments may happen less frequently. The silent treatment might appear less often. Open conflict may decrease. But the reason conflict decreases is not because the relationship became healthier. It decreases because one person has unconsciously accepted the role of emotional regulator for the entire dynamic. They are constantly monitoring the emotional atmosphere and adjusting themselves to maintain peace. Over time, this creates a profound shift in identity. The victim begins seeing themselves through the manipulator's perspective. The criticisms repeated during earlier stages start to feel like truths rather than accusations. If the manipulator frequently said they were too sensitive, they begin believing they are overly emotional. If the manipulator repeatedly claimed they were selfish, they begin worrying constantly about appearing selfish. If the manipulator accused them of misunderstanding situations, they begin doubting their own judgment automatically. This internalization is the true goal of long-term manipulation. Because once someone adopts the manipulator's narrative about who they are, control no longer requires effort. The victim becomes the enforcer of a manipulator's worldview. They silence themselves before the manipulator needs to silence them. They apologize before accusations appear. They compromise their needs before conflict even begins. And because this process happens slowly, the victim rarely notices how much they have changed. But there are subtle psychological signals that reveal what has happened. One of the most common signs is constant self-doubt. The victim begins questioning decisions that once felt simple. They ask themselves repeatedly whether their reactions are reasonable. They search for reassurance from others but still struggle to trust their own conclusions. This happens because gaslighting has weakened the foundation of personal perception. When someone has spent months or years being told their interpretation of reality is wrong, their mind becomes cautious about trusting itself. Another sign is emotional exhaustion. Maintaining peace in a manipulative relationship requires continuous mental effort. The victim is always calculating, adjusting, predicting, and managing emotions. This cognitive load drains mental energy over time. They may feel tired even when nothing dramatic has happened recently. They may struggle to focus on personal goals or interests because so much attention is devoted to maintaining the relationship stability. A third sign is isolation. Manipulators often create distance between the victim and other sources of emotional support. Sometimes this happens directly through criticism of friends or family. The manipulator might say things like, "Your friends don't really understand you," or "Your family is trying to turn you against me." Other times, isolation happens indirectly through shame or self-doubt. The victim may stop sharing relationship problems with others because they worry about appearing dramatic, unfair, or disloyal. Over time, this isolation becomes extremely powerful. When someone lacks external perspectives, the manipulator's version of reality becomes harder to challenge. Without outside feedback, it becomes easier to believe that the problems in the relationship must be caused by personal flaws rather than manipulation. This is why many victims stay in manipulative dynamics far longer than they expected they ever would. From the outside, observers may wonder why the person doesn't simply leave. But from the inside, the psychological structure of the relationship feels far more complicated. The victim is not just evaluating behavior. They are evaluating identity, loyalty, responsibility, and emotional history. They remember the early stage of the relationship when everything felt meaningful and intense. They remember the affection, the attention, and the promises that once existed. And because intermittent reinforcement occasionally brings back brief moments of warmth, the victim continues hoping that the relationship might return to what it once seemed to be. This hope can be incredibly powerful. It keeps people invested long after evidence suggests that the dynamic will not change. But eventually, many victims reach a moment where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The confusion that once felt like isolated incidents begins forming a clear structure. They notice how often their concerns are dismissed. They recognize the cycles of affection followed by criticism. They realize how frequently guilt appears whenever they attempt to set boundaries. And perhaps most importantly, they begin noticing how much of themselves they have gradually suppressed. This realization can feel both painful and liberating at the same time. Painful because it reveals how deeply the manipulation has affected their sense of self. Liberating because once the pattern becomes visible, the manipulator's power begins to weaken. Manipulation depends on confusion, self-doubt, and emotional dependency. Awareness disrupts all three. When someone clearly recognizes tactics like gaslighting, love bombing, triangulation, guilt manipulation, and the silent treatment, those tactics lose much of their psychological impact. The manipulator may still attempt them, but they no longer operate invisibly. Instead of wondering whether they misunderstood a situation, the victim can identify the strategy being used. Instead of feeling guilty for setting boundaries, they can recognize the emotional pressure being applied. This shift does not immediately solve the problem. Manipulative dynamics can be difficult to leave, especially when emotional attachment, shared history, or practical circumstances are involved. But awareness restores something that manipulation tries to remove: the ability to trust one's own perception again. And once that trust begins rebuilding, a person can start reclaiming the parts of themselves that were gradually pushed aside. They begin expressing opinions more freely. They reconnect with friends or family they had distanced themselves from. They stop apologizing automatically for emotions that are completely reasonable. Slowly, the internal narrative begins to change. Instead of asking what is wrong with me, they begin asking why was I taught to believe something was wrong with me. This question is powerful because it shifts responsibility back to where it belongs. Manipulation thrives when victims assume they are the problem. It weakens when they realize that many of their reactions were normal responses to abnormal behavior. Over time, rebuilding trust and personal perception becomes the foundation for healthier relationships. Boundaries become clearer. Emotional manipulation becomes easier to detect. And most importantly, self-worth stops depending entirely on someone else's approval. Understanding the psychological tricks manipulators use is not just about identifying toxic people. It is about recognizing patterns that can appear in many types of relationships, including friendships, workplaces, families, and romantic partnerships. These tactics persist because they exploit universal human instincts: the desire for connection, the fear of rejection, the need for belonging, and the discomfort of guilt. Manipulators do not invent these instincts. They simply learn how to use them. But once someone understands how these psychological levers work, the dynamic changes completely. What once felt mysterious begins to look predictable. What once felt like personal failure begins to look like manipulation. And with that clarity comes the possibility of something extremely important: the freedom to choose relationships that are based on respect rather than control, honesty rather than confusion, and emotional safety rather than psychological power. Because the most effective defense against manipulation is not aggression, suspicion, or constant confrontation. It is awareness. Awareness of your own instincts, awareness of emotional patterns, and awareness that healthy relationships do not require you to doubt your reality, suppress your needs, or constantly prove your worth. Once you see manipulation clearly, it becomes much harder for anyone to quietly reshape your world again.